extremely good Google Slides live stream. This week with no slides, because it is the dreaded recap episode. You noticed I missed an episode last week. Of course, all of you who do watch this at home. I was taking a vacay in place, or a staycay, as they say. I was just sitting on a couch and not paying attention to anything classics related for an entire week at the end of the quarter. But now I'm back. On that live stream. And I wanted to make this week's kind of like I said, a recap, a wrap-up episode. You think about everything up to now is kind of season 1 of this stream. I want to kind of bundle it all up and talk about some of the things that one could take home from it. So one of my goals in putting these videos together is to show the range of what classics can be about. You know, it's not just about the text that we usually focus on. It's also about, you know, kind of marginal stuff, like a lot of different kinds of pseudoscience, for instance. Dream interpretation, spontaneous generation, physiognomies, scientific concepts that we don't see as scientific, so understandably they're a little displaced from the center of attention. They're not encapsulated in texts that are necessarily great works of literature, although they are fantastically interesting. And so these pseudosciences, although knowing that they exist is really important for understanding the ancient world and for understanding some of these great works of literature, maybe sort of drift out of focus for us. They're not something that we necessarily learn about in class. But aside from that, you know, there are also, as it turns out, over this first season, a lot of people and places that are likewise out of focus and marginal from the point of view of classics. We talked about Persians, the great inscription at the Kaaba of Zoroaster. We talked about Syrians, the Manichaean texts, Bardesanes, Edessa. We talked about Berbers and Tifinagh. We talked about the changing population of Socotra, and this goes all the way back to Nubia and the old Nubian language and the miracle of St. Menas, which I talked about in the first episode of this way back in January. Well, when we're talking about people and places and not sciences or pseudosciences or anything like that, we still have to ask the question, why are they marginal? Why are they out of focus? And this is a more uncomfortable conversation, although an important one to have, you know, not only to understand what classics has been in the past and how it works, how it's worked historically, but also kind of an urgent conversation to have given the news that is going on right now and the protest movement that's building up all over America to bring about real change. So you may know, you probably have seen in the news, that classics as a field has a pretty well-deserved bad reputation for focusing on white folks and for claiming to be for white folks. Well, that's not quite right to say that it focuses on white folks. What's more, I think, accurate to say would be that classics has in the past made up white folks, even help invent what whiteness is, and then focused on that identity. Sort of by turning Greek or Roman into an ethnic identity, collapsing them into the same ethnic identity, and tracing a genealogy between that ethnic identity and some sort of Europe or West or whatever. This is the story that classics has tended to tell in popular books about classics, even in academic work, although that's not so much the case anymore. Certainly it's still the story that gets told about classics in a lot of online sources and popularizations. And that means necessarily you can't tell that story unless you push a lot of the non-Greek Roman stuff that I've been talking about in these videos, for instance, off to the side, off to the margins. And that happens in a couple of ways. One thing is that those topics are just understudied, right? So the evidence doesn't get processed, it doesn't get interpreted, doesn't get publicized. For instance, there's just a ton of untranslated old Nubian texts sitting around, and you can be sure that if those texts were in Latin, or in Greek probably at the level of completeness that these texts are, they would have been translated by now. Just not the scholarly labor has not been put into translating and working through these texts. Even when the evidence has been sort of taken account of by someone or dealt with by scholarship or even publicized, that evidence kind of gets ignored in survey courses about the ancient world. For instance, a course on the ancient Mediterranean probably will not tell you word one about Socotra, about Nubia, about Syriac, about a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about in these videos over the course of the quarter. Lord knows I took courses like that in my time, and none of these topics were mentioned. I bring them to your attention so that you can perhaps pursue them and get a bit more of a complete classics education than I was able to have. But sometimes when that evidence is just out there, when the evidence is plain as day, it gets hidden and suppressed and snowed over in ways that say something, I think, really depressing about the way that classics works as a field. You may have heard about a couple of these controversies, and I've got links, if you're interested in exploring them in more depth, in the text box below this video. There's the case of the controversy over the painted statues, ancient polychrome statuary. It is clear as day that ancient statues were painted. Surface analysis shows traces of paint. So we know that ancient statues were not, as they now appear to be, the marble ones anyway, white by default. These kind of icons of whiteness are the result of historical decay and damage to the statue surface. They used to be painted. They used to be much more colorful. Now that's a fact. But Sarah Bond is one, I think, now in a series of classicists and art historians who've brought this to public attention and then just been viciously attacked, not only by kind of amateurs who can't imagine that the whiteness they love in these statues is not original, but also even by some classicists who are not art historians and not up to date with the scientific evidence. The field of classics turns out to be kind of deeply attached to whiteness in that way. Something similar happened actually with controversy that Mary Beard, the Roman historian, got involved with about representations of black people in modern depictions of what ancient Rome was like. There was some cartoon that had a black African in ancient London, and all these right-wingers flipped their wigs about it, saying, well, that's just political correctness, there were no black people in ancient England. And Mary Beard comes on and she says, oh, actually that was based on a real guy who was governor of Britannia and was from Africa. We know, again, basically for a fact, that there were black people in England. Just black Roman citizens who happened to live in England in the Roman imperial period. And yet Mary Beard, for pointing this out, just gets attacked again and again, not only by sort of Twitter amateurs, but again by some academics, not classicists in this case, because classicists know better, but some other sort of bozo academics. So this is a kind of thing that happens more frequently than one would like, because one would like it to happen never, but it happens disturbingly often in classics, where sort of the default assumptions about the whiteness of the ancient world get challenged in even sometimes quite trivial ways. And people respond to this just by freaking out. Vitriolic attacks, ignoring the facts, clinging to an image of antiquity that is white and that they can't really seem to let go. So this raises the question, fuck classics? An attractive possibility. But I think that there are bigger historiographical issues at stake that should lead us to be cautious about sort of tossing the entire field. It's an old one, but there's some useful stuff to it. So classics does give us a method. It's a methodology for humanizing dead people, for understanding dead civilizations, dead societies as being like us but simultaneously different, that I think can be really useful, that supplements what we'd get out of history and anthropology in ways that are really important. Now that humanization has been applied very selectively, as I said, and what classics can do is now try and apply it a bit more broadly. If you think about the origin of classics as a field, you really get it in a lot of accounts, originating in kind of the Renaissance study or invention of the classical period as something distinct from the Middle Ages, something distinct from these so-called Dark Ages, time of barbarism, when it's just a bunch of people running around speaking German and building cathedrals. A period of non-civilization that separates the Italian Renaissance from the ancient world, from Rome and Greece, this other kind of civilization. They're old, they're different from us, they're very strange in a lot of respects to us, but they're also like us, in the sense that they have a civilization, they're these kinds of fully realized human beings, living in a society, as the saying goes. They're like us, and like us, they're different from the barbarians of the Middle Ages. So this is a way of thinking about the classical world that also gets kind of worked out in the New World encounter and colonialism in the New Worlds. The question that the Spanish are asking themselves somewhat facetiously as they go about enslaving and murdering is, are these people who live in the New Worlds, are they kind of primitives? Are they barbarians? Are they like the people who live between the classical period and the Renaissance? Or are they classical? Are they civilized like us? And if they are classical, then certain ethical obligations follow from that. We cannot murder and enslave as freely. So this is the debate that gets staged kind of between Bartolomé de las Casas, this famous advocate for the rights of the indigenous peoples of the New Worlds, and a group of scholars, I think represented by Luis Gines de Sepulveda at the Valladolid debates. And de las Casas kind of defends the rights of the natives of the New World by saying, well, they're just like the ancient Romans. They're just like the ancient Greeks. They have a civilization that's like that. There are a lot of parallels that Bartolomé de las Casas will point out to justify ascribing these peoples the same rights, the jus gentium, that we assign to all peoples in Europe. And this, among other things, is why we call temples in the New World pyramids. It's a terminology that gets introduced over the course of this debate, and it's classicizing terminology, saying they're not building idolatrous temples, they're building these wonders of the world, pyramids, something that brings together the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca with classical civilization. So their classicism is a tool for humanizing people and for understanding them as having a civilization, rather than considering them as kind of these indistinguishable barbarian hordes who can just be appropriated as though they were not even human. You get around to kind of Enlightenment historiography. There's this kind of stadial history where all peoples move through fixed steps. They're kind of just wandering barbarians, herders, steppe nomads, farmers, and then the classical civilization is always kind of a step in the stadial histories. It's a way of assigning a civilizing moment to societies that have existed in the past, and assimilating them to the present day, saying that in some qualitative way they're like Enlightenment Europe. So in all these cases, classics is kind of about understanding certain historical formations as civilizations. Now, as has come out in this kind of short survey, classics has also been about making these kind of invidious distinctions, saying, oh, this is classical, this is barbarian, this deserves treatment as a human civilization made up of human beings, this is just an assemblage of barbarians, do what you like with them. So that distinction-making element of classics, you can say, well, classics etymologically means making distinctions. It comes from this idea of Roman tax categories originally. But, etymology is not destiny, as I talked about a couple of weeks ago on this stream. It doesn't have to be that way. We understand that classics has been about making these kind of invidious distinctions between civilization and barbarism in the past. We don't have to keep doing that in the future. We can have every group of people from the past as possible contemporaries for ourselves in the same way that we have Greeks and Romans, or that traditionally in classics we've had Greeks and Romans. And that's another reason that I'm trying to get you, students, interested in these kind of areas that have been marginalized by the way classics is usually done. Because my hope is that these areas won't always be marginal in the sense of understudied, underreported. And that you yourself may end up doing some of the research that brings these civilizations into the center of the way that classics is being done. Now you may be asking, why am I getting other people interested in this stuff via videos rather than just, I don't know, doing it myself, or, I rule classrooms with an iron fist, why don't I just teach it in classes? Well, the other way I framed this series of videos, and it's going to be kind of a continuing framing over the next season, or who knows how many more seasons of this, is that they're about stuff that I don't get to teach. You might ask, well, why not? In part, it's the demands of the Greek and Latin curriculum, right? I have to teach classes in upper division Greek and Latin so that everyone can learn those things, these important tools of philology, neither of which are, by the way, the property of Europe or the property of like some kind of white ethnicity. The authors that we teach about here are ethnically diverse. Apuleius, Augustine, Terence are all from Africa. Lucian and Porphyry are from Syria. People who write in Greek and write in Latin are from all over the Roman world, and the Roman world is as Mary Beard argued against all of those bozos who didn't want to hear it, quite diverse, a diverse place. All of those authors that I listed tend to kind of inhabit these more cosmopolitan identities, that is, they write as people in a Greek tradition, or they write as Roman Christians, or they write as traditional Latin authors, Latin novelists. Those cosmopolitan identities that they inhabit tend to obscure their rootedness in a very diverse Greco-Roman world, but understanding that diversity is also really important for understanding those authors, all of them. You can't really understand what they're on about fully unless you understand that the Greco-Roman world is not just Greece, is not just Italy, and those places are not just white people. Now, the stuff I've been talking about on these videos is actually things that fall outside of Greek and Latin kind of linguistically, and that's more of a challenge to teach about. We're talking about something like Bardesane's Book of the Laws of the Country. This is very self-consciously establishing a kind of a new identity as a writer in Syriac. It's one of the first books that is written in Syriac, not by Bardesanes, but written by one of his disciples. Bardesanes himself wrote a whole bunch of stuff that we've now lost. But that book could be the subject of an entire kind of class, an upper-level class, if there were a constituency for Syriac, which at a university this small and where languages are so underfunded, there's just not going to be. I can't engage with that material in a classroom setting in the way that I'd like to necessarily. We do independent studies on it, but that's something that neither you as students nor I as a professor actually get credit for doing. Well, what about classes in translation? I'd love to talk about this stuff in seminar format. I rarely get the chance to do those outside of language classes. I have to do big lectures. And this is because of the way that UCSC, like many kind of modern public universities, is structured, where the emphasis is always on enrollment, always on teaching topics that are going to be popular without people having any kind of specialized knowledge, topics that people have heard of before and are already interested in. Well, this seems in a way responsive to what people want. It seems kind of populist, but it has this kind of, I think, exclusionary effect and marginalizing effect for things that are not kind of these conventional topics, right? Because as a classicist, I'm going to be teaching about things that are kind of recognized as components of classical education that bring about cultural capital, that are part of cultural literacy. Things like, just to think back on the last couple of classes that I've taught that have pulled large enrollments, Homer's Odyssey, classical mythology. Now, because these topics belong kind of to the traditional legacy of classics, they carry with them a lot of that kind of classical whiteness or emphasis on whiteness. They're not exactly a good lens to look at other ethnicities, other cultures in antiquity, either in terms of the extent to which people who are explicitly non-white are featured in the text, which is usually via negative characterization, or as a kind of a starting off point for considering culture more broadly in antiquity. Because if you center your inquiry on these kind of Greek and Roman cultural classics, it's going to distort your result. They're lenses that you can use, but they're probably not the best one to study the actual diversity of the ancient world. So the classics curriculum as it's currently structured, or just the role of classics in the general university curriculum, is actually part of the problem. There's this vicious cycle of traditional treatments of things in classics and enrollment demands, which forces a person to talk about things that are not the things that I talk about in these videos. However, that's going to have to change. And I pledge to do better in the future for myself. Hopefully the university does not fire me for ditching enrollments, as I try to teach some large lecture courses on things like the stuff that I've been bringing up in these videos, or researching for these videos. Helping people have a sense of the ancient worlds beyond classical mythology, beyond Homer's Odyssey, beyond sort of the classics as they've been conventionally understood. Because the point of an education is not just to teach you more about what you already know, but to expose you to things that you didn't even know existed, didn't even know you might be interested in. A respect in which I think I was largely failed by my classics education, but again, hopefully you don't have to suffer through the same kind of thing. But it's one thing to say that Black Lives mattered in the past, which I think historians are coming around to. It is more important to say, as people are now finally saying, it took them long enough. It is more important to say that Black Lives Matter now. That representation in terms of our curricula, in terms of what we teach about, is only one side of classics' problem. The other side of it, and this is a very serious one and more difficult to deal with in terms of individual decisions, is that the field makes people of color feel excluded because there are a lot of racists in it. A lot of the racism in classics is just unconscious, which doesn't help. The kind of racism that older white people just have the treatment of people of color as model minorities, the treatment of people of color as privileged sources about the ethnicity to which they're assigned. This kind of unconscious racism that is felt as racism by people of color, but the older white faculty in the field don't necessarily realize that that's what they're doing or understand that. So that's a problem, and it's hard to treat, but sometimes the racism is just like active and conscious. And I've seen the first of those two things, that unconscious racism, happen a lot to professors that I know and respect, and I certainly should have stepped up at the time and will do in the future. I've heard about this latter aggressive, kind of active and conscious racism, some very gross incidents, not only online involving amateurs, but also involving sort of professional conferences. Got a couple of links about the SCS, the major professional conference in classics, the Society for Classical Studies annual conference, in the text box below the stream that you can check out. There were a couple of major incidents of racism at that conference. Not a good look for our professional organization, especially as the people who spoke up at the time were censored by the professional organization, which I think is just insane. So there's a lot about the profession that needs to change. And that's stuff that I can do differently. It's also stuff that you can do differently. And you don't need to hear it from me, but you should definitely be cool to one another, and you should stick up for one another. If there is racism happening, if somebody is doing racism, whether it's conscious or unconscious, you got to stick up for people who are being victimized by that, because if nobody sticks up for them, they may feel like they're being gaslit into treating that as the norm, and that's going to perpetuate the bad system that we've got now. There is no room for racists in future classics, and vice versa, there's not going to be any room for racist classics in the future either. The field will just die out if these problems are not addressed now, and if we don't try to do something about them. There is a very pessimistic take in one of the essays that I've linked to below, which may be right, but I think that if I try and you all try, maybe we can all do better and produce a different kind of classics in which the videos that I've been making don't have to be framed as stuff that's on the fringe, stuff that I can't teach, but rather just kind of the center of what a person teaches about. And I want to mention at the end here just some concrete things that you could think about doing, and that I'll help you do if you're interested. There's the Sportula microgrants program, which has been very helpful for students who are finding themselves in a situation where they can't continue in classics, where a small financial problem is keeping them from being able to move forward. If you can donate to that, even a small amount of money is great. If you can't, wait a few years until you got some cash floating around and then kick Sportula some money. Think about, this is something that I'd like to organize through the Classics Library here. Let's think about maybe book exchanges, right? You finished your first couple of years of Latin. You don't necessarily need those Latin textbooks anymore. Well, let's leave them in the library so that the financial costs are not an obstacle for people getting into classics. Talk about helping your fellow students via working groups, via tutoring. I know that there are some of you who do this. It's a tradition that we should continue going forward. And if anybody else has any suggestions, of course, this is a dialogue, so hit me up via email. You know where I live. Next week, we'll be back to normally scheduled program with Season 2. Everyone have a good night.